Late on the night of March 21, 1967, a radio at the 2nd Brigade headquarters of the 4th Infantry Division stopped receiving check-ins from a long-range reconnaissance patrol operating in the Plei Doc, a stretch of dense jungle in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, right up against the Cambodian border. The team had been transmitting, and then it hadn't. Nobody at Brigade could raise them. The frequency was open, the signal was out, and the jungle on the other end was quiet. That silence set off a chain of events that would put 2 rifle companies into one of the worst firefights of the entire war in the Highlands, kill 27 American soldiers and wound 48 more, and produce a Medal of Honor. All because a handful of men on a small team patrol stopped answering their radio. And here's the thing that stays with me about this particular story. Those men from the LRRP team were never found. Not during the rescue. Not after the battle. Not ever. I want to tell this story the way the people involved experienced it. Which means starting from the radio, from the silence itself, and working outward in both directions. Back toward who those men were and what they were doing out there, and forward into what their silence cost the men who went looking for them. To understand what that silence meant, and why the reaction to it was so immediate, you need to understand how long-range reconnaissance patrols worked in Vietnam, because most people don't. The movies give you platoon-sized infantry patrols, 30 guys humping through the bush. LRRPs were nothing like that. A LRRP team was typically 4 to 6 men, sometimes fewer. They carried no heavy weapons. Their job wasn't to fight. Their job was to go deep into areas where regular units couldn't operate. Triple-canopy jungle, border regions, places where the terrain was so dense and the distances so vast that the only way to know what the enemy was doing was to put a small group of Americans on the ground and have them look. They moved slowly. They moved quietly. In some cases, they went days without speaking above a whisper. They reported what they saw, marked locations, tracked trails, counted enemy soldiers, and called in airstrikes or artillery if they found something worth hitting. And the entire architecture of a LRRP mission depended on one piece of equipment: the PRC-25 radio strapped to the back of the team's radio operator. The PRC-25 weighed about 23 pounds with the battery. It had a reliable range of maybe 5 to 8 kilometers in open terrain, but in the jungle, under the canopy, in valleys near ridgelines that blocked line of sight, that range could drop to almost nothing. Teams scheduled radio checks at fixed intervals. If you missed a check, the relay station or the tactical operations center at your base would try to raise you. If you missed 2 checks, something was probably wrong. If you went silent for an extended period, the assumption was that your team was either compromised, in contact, or dead. There was no middle ground with that kind of silence. You couldn't send a text message. You couldn't ping a GPS location. If the radio went quiet and stayed quiet, the only way to find out what had happened to those men was to send more men in after them. And this was the Central Highlands. Not the flat paddies of the Mekong Delta. Not the coastal lowlands, where you could at least see the sky. The highlands were mountains covered in triple-canopy jungle, 3 distinct layers of vegetation stacked on top of each other, so thick that at ground level you moved through a kind of permanent green twilight. Visibility in the worst areas might be 15, 20 feet. A trail could disappear in front of you. A man could be 10 yards away, and you'd never see him. The terrain swallowed sound, swallowed light, swallowed radio signals. It was the kind of place where a small team could vanish, not because anything dramatic happened, but because the jungle simply closed behind them and didn't let the signal out. The 4th Infantry Division had been operating in the Central Highlands since the fall of 1966, running a series of operations designed to monitor and disrupt North Vietnamese infiltration from Cambodia. By early 1967, the division's commander, Major General William Pears, had evidence that the North Vietnamese were building up forces in the Plei Trap Valley, a remote, rugged corridor between 2 rivers in western Pleiku province, about 20 miles from the border. Aerial sightings and intelligence reports pointed to elements of the 1st NVA Division operating in the area. Colonel James Adamson's 2nd Brigade had been pushing into the Plei Doc in mid-March, using LRRP teams as forward eyes. These teams were inserted by helicopter, usually with an elaborate deception routine. The Huey would drop into multiple clearings, hovering and lifting off to disguise which one had actually deposited the team. Once on the ground, the men moved into the jungle and began their observation. The whole point was to stay invisible. A LRRP team that got detected was a LRRP team in trouble, because 4 men with rifles and a radio cannot hold ground against a platoon, let alone a company. What I haven't been able to determine with certainty, and I want to be straight about that, is the exact composition and names of the specific LRRP team that went silent on March 21st. The historical record, including Warren Wilkins's detailed account and the after-action reports from the 4th Infantry Division, identifies the team as belonging to the 2nd Brigade's long-range reconnaissance patrol element. But the names of those men and the precise circumstances of their disappearance are not documented in the sources I've been able to examine. What is documented, in detail, is everything that happened next. When the brigade lost contact with the team late that night, Colonel Adamson made the call that any commander in that situation would have made. He ordered Lieutenant Colonel Harold Lee, commanding the 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry, to go get them. Lee was to send troops to the team's last known position in the Plei Doc and find out what happened. That order went out on the night of the 21st, and Lee dispatched 2 companies at first light on the 22nd. Company A, led by Captain William Sands, a Citadel graduate described by the men who served under him as hard-nosed and aggressive, moved west-southwest along a ridgeline. Company B, under Captain Robert Shawley, moved on a parallel axis to the south. The plan was straightforward. Push toward the LRRP team's area, locate the men, and extract them. In the dense terrain of the Plei Doc, with limited visibility and vegetation so thick that units could pass within 50 yards of each other without making contact, it was a plan that depended on speed and a certain amount of luck. They didn't get the luck. Company A had covered only a short distance through the jungle when Captain Sands halted the column and rearranged his platoons. He wanted his 1st platoon to move forward and come abreast of the 2nd platoon, broadening the company's front. The 3rd and 4th platoons would stay in column behind them. It was a standard adjustment for a movement to contact in dense terrain, spreading out the front to reduce the chance of getting hit in a single file. The 1st platoon slid into position alongside the 2nd around 7:30 in the morning. Sergeant Ron Snyder, a squad leader in the 2nd platoon, put the distance between the 2 platoons at 50 to 100 yards. And then, Snyder said, the 1st platoon was hit. What Snyder heard was the opening of a large-scale ambush by North Vietnamese regulars, later identified as a battalion of the 95B NVA Regiment, dug in along the ridgeline in front of and to the left of Company A. The fire came from hidden positions, rifles, automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades. The 1st and 2nd platoons, caught in the kill zone, started taking casualties immediately. The company medic, a man named John Bockover, everybody called him Doc, said that within the first 4 or 5 minutes, Company A had 27 killed and 45 wounded. He heard medic and started running toward the front. His own words, "There were NVA all around us." Captain Sands got on the radio. He called Company B directly. Shawley recalled the transmission. Sands was shouting, "You gotta get down here! We are taking heavy casualties and don't know how long we can hold out." Then, while adjusting artillery fire, a rocket-propelled grenade hit the command group and killed Sands instantly. Command of Company A passed to First Sergeant David McNerney, a career soldier on his 3rd tour in Vietnam. And what McNerney did over the next several hours is one of those stories that sounds exaggerated until you realize the Army gave him the Medal of Honor for it, and the men who were there confirmed every detail. McNerney called in artillery fire to within 20 meters of his own positions. 20 meters. That's the distance from where you're sitting to the other side of a two-lane road. Tom Carty, a private first class in the company, described it afterward. The rounds came screaming in, exploding with shrapnel cutting vegetation, and hitting soldiers on both sides without discrimination. McNerney was gambling that the artillery would do more damage to the enemy positions than to his own. And at 20 meters, that's a narrow bet. He also needed helicopter resupply, and the pilots overhead couldn't find the company in the canopy. So McNerney climbed a tall tree under fire and tied an orange identification panel to the highest branch he could reach. A helicopter pilot named Don Rawlinson spotted it and flew in with supplies. Rawlinson told his co-pilot, "My God, can you believe someone climbed up there in that tree and did that?" McNerney had already been knocked down by a grenade blast earlier that morning. While Company A fought for survival, Company B was trying to reach them. Shawley had heard the gunfire, couldn't raise Sands on the radio. Another silence, another dead frequency, and started moving immediately. But the North Vietnamese had placed a blocking force between the two companies. When Company B's 4th Platoon hit the blocking position, they were pinned down in a bamboo field by 2 machine guns and snipers in the trees. Specialist Victor Renza, a machine gunner in the 2nd Platoon, was setting up his M60 when a rifle round cracked past his ear so close he could hear it. His legs went weak. He thought he'd been targeted specifically, so he grabbed the gun and crawled along a creek bed, looking for a better position. The two companies spent the rest of the morning and into the afternoon fighting separately. Company A in a shrinking perimeter, Company B trying to break through. Shawley called in everything available: 105mm guns, 150mm guns, fighter bombers, A-1E Sky Raiders dropping napalm. The weight of American firepower eventually cracked the blocking force, and by early afternoon, Company B was moving again. They linked up later that afternoon. Shawley met McNerney, who told him Sands was dead. The two companies consolidated into a single perimeter, evacuated the dead and wounded, and dug in for the night. The battle in the Plei Doc had cost the 1st Battalion, 8th Infantry 27 killed and 48 wounded. Company A took 22 of the dead, and the LRRP team, the men whose silence had started all of this, was never found. Think about that for a second. 2 full rifle companies fought a day-long battle within the operating area of that missing team. Hundreds of men moved through the jungle where those 4 or 5 or 6 Americans were supposed to be. Artillery pounded the ridgeline. Aircraft dropped bombs and napalm. The ground was torn open, and when it was over, when the smoke cleared and the survivors started counting bodies and policing the battlefield, the men they'd come for were simply not there. No bodies, no equipment, no sign. That's the sentence I keep rereading. Not recovered, not accounted for. The sources say the team was never found. And then the record moves on to the next operation, the next contact, the next set of numbers. Sometime that evening, General Peers called Adamson and asked for an enemy body count. Saigon wanted to know. Adamson said he had no idea. General Larson called and asked the same question. Adamson picked a number, 150. The next day, they found about 45 enemy dead on the ground, and the inflated figure was withdrawn. The official division report settled on 136, a number that was probably somewhere between the count they could confirm and the count they couldn't. But what about those 4 or 5 or 6 Americans who went into the Plei Doc on a reconnaissance mission, carried a 23-pound radio, checked in on schedule until they didn't, and then disappeared? The record doesn't say what happened to them. It doesn't tell us if they were ambushed, captured, killed by artillery, or swallowed by a jungle so dense that a company of 150 men couldn't find them even while fighting on top of their last known position. We don't know if the radio failed, if the operator was hit, if the team was already dead before the silence was noticed. What we know is that the silence was real, and that the response to it was immediate, and that the response cost 27 more American lives, and that a first sergeant named David McNerney climbed a tree under fire and called artillery danger close and held his company together because he thought those missing men might still be alive somewhere in the jungle below him. And we know that 2 months later, in May, Companies A and B were operating together again in the Ia Char Valley when a platoon from Company B was ambushed and overrun, and it was Company A that went out to find them. Victor Renza, who'd been in the creek bed back in March, was one of the men found by Company A after the overrun. He said later that when he saw it was the same men, the same guys they'd fought to reach in the Plei Doc, he couldn't believe it. He said it created a bond between the two companies that lasted over 50 years. That bond started with a radio that went quiet, with men who went looking for other men, because that's what you did. You didn't leave people out there, even when finding them meant walking into something you couldn't see, in terrain you couldn't navigate, against an enemy you couldn't count. You went anyway, because the alternative was a frequency that nobody answered. And that was something no one in that war could live with. The LRRP team from the Plei Doc has no memorial that I'm aware of. Their names, as far as I've been able to determine, are not in the public accounts of this battle. They exist in the record as a gap, a missing transmission, a search order, and then the chaos that followed. If you happen to know who they were, I'd like to hear from you, because someone should say their names out loud.